Thank you very much, Mr Bowen. It's a great pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and it's also a great pleasure to follow the member from Surrey Heath, whose great passion for Brexit, I would re-emphasise, has brought us to this particular position. We wouldn't be having debates again about rerunning the independence referendum had the former Prime Minister not gambled the UK farm and lost. And indeed, there was no apology in the 17 minutes of oratory from the Right Honourable Gentleman from Surrey Heath on his apology for the bus, or his apology for getting us into this constitutional quagmire. And I would emphasise, Mr Bowen, that the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, with no policies whatsoever, made it her one policy at the Scottish elections back in May that said to the Scottish people, vote Conservatives and we will protect the Union. Everything that's happened since then has risked the very United Kingdom that I and many people in this chamber voted and worked very hard to protect. And can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Glasgow North on securing this debate? There is one thing I would agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman for Surrey Heath on, is the fact that we never have debates in Westminster Hall on how to eradicate poverty in Scotland, how to use the powers of the Scottish Parliament to make sure we can provide finances for public services, how to close the attainment gap, how to make sure Scotland's outward looking to the world. It's all grievance, it's all constitution, and it's all taking the debate and the agenda away from the issues that actually really matter in Scotland about public services, and where the Scottish Parliament, using its powers, or in this case not, would be a good place to lie. I will give way to the Honourable Member.
I did point out in my contribution, and would point out to both of the members that have spoken and are speaking, that the First Minister is at this moment addressing the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament, announcing, amongst other things, £750 million to help close the education attainment gap, guarantee that the health budget of Scotland will increase by at least £500 million more than inflation every year, doubling the amount of free care available to all 3- and 4-year-olds and the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds across Scotland. So the idea that the Scottish Government is not using the powers of the Scottish Parliament and is not delivering for the people of Scotland is simply false.
Well, I'm delighted, because after 10 years it's about time that the Scottish Parliament started to invest in the educational attainment gap and in our public services. And that contribution and the intervention from the Honourable Gentleman highlights the fact that the Scottish Parliament does have powers to make a difference in people's lives. But his contribution to begin this debate was that the Scottish Parliament has no powers whatsoever, and indeed even mentioned the tugboat that was taken away, as if the Scottish Parliament meets to discuss what it can't do, rather than trying to change the lives of people that it can. But let's get back to this debate about the claim of right, and it is worth just reading out the start of the declaration of the 1989 claim of right that was indeed re-emphasised in the Scottish Parliament and voted on in 2012. And it said, and I quote, "We, gather as the Scottish Constitutional Convention, do hereby acknowledge the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, and do hereby declare and pledge that in all their actions and deliberations their interests shall be paramount." Mr Bowen, we have heard much from the mover of this particular motion about the importance of respecting Scottish sovereignty. And respecting the popular will is important, not just in Scotland, but across the United Kingdom. And let's not forget, and it's been mentioned by the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Surrey Heath, that the Scottish National Party, indeed along with many Scottish Tories, did not participate in the Constitutional Convention. In that conversation with Civic Scotland, with politicians, with groups, with universities, with business, about what the future of devolution in Scotland should look like, and they didn't accept the wording of the claim of right that it was founded upon. Indeed, it was only the Labour Party and the Scottish Labour Party that's been entirely consistent in upholding the words of the claim of right, because it did pledge, and I quote again, to agree a scheme for an Assembly or Parliament of Scotland to mobilise Scottish opinion and secure the approval of the Scottish people for that scheme. And it went on to say, to assert the right of the Scottish people to secure implementation of that scheme. And when the Labour Party was elected to government in 1997, it was one of the first bills of that particular Labour government that delivered the referendum on devolution, that mobilised popular support for its approval, asserted the right and the sovereign right of the Scottish people, delivered on the result, and created the Scottish Parliament that we have here today. No mention of that from the Honourable Gentleman from Glasgow North about how we said to the Scottish people we'd deliver something, got into power, and then delivered it on the basis of what the Scottish people were telling us they wanted to do. And indeed, to be fair, the SNP, when they were elected in 2011, on a manifesto that pledged an independence referendum, we respected the mandate for that too, because the Scottish people voted for that mandate. And in 2014, we had that referendum. And this time, the Scottish people voted to stay in the UK. So taking the word of the claim of right as our guide, if we can, the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, they voted for a powerful Scottish Parliament, but within being an integral part of the United Kingdom. The claim of right, put into practice, voted on in 2012 in the Scottish Parliament, referendum happens in 2014, the Scottish people speak, that's the sovereign right of the Scottish people to stay within the United Kingdom, but with a much more powerful Scottish Parliament. That is the spirit and the substance of the very claim of right that we are discussing today. And I would like to go back to the intervention from the member from Glasgow North, because the Scottish Parliament is one of the most powerful parliaments, devolved parliaments in the world. And it's about time that we had politicians who are elected by the people, that they looked back at that claim of right and said we were elected to deliver for the Scottish people with a powerful Scottish Parliament and get on with the day job that they've been elected to do. But every single day since the polls closed, on the 19th of September 2014, the SNP have looked for any single trigger whatsoever to get a different result in the referendum. And that is surely the complete antithesis of the claim of right. And during the last referendum, I'm happy to give way.
Thank you,
Mr. Bowman, and thank the honourable member for giving way. I wonder, though, would you acknowledge that during that referendum campaign, the independence referendum campaign, it was made very clear that one of the major benefits of being in the UK was remaining part of the EU, and that is now simply not the case?
But the evidence shows that people didn't vote on that particular basis. And indeed, what the SNP are now telling us is that because the UK, and I was on the same side as the Honourable Lady in terms of staying in the European Union, but because the UK have turned away from a market that's worth £12 billion to the Scottish economy and 250,000 jobs, that the solution to that is for Scotland to turn away from another union which has 1 million jobs and £50 billion worth of trading. That is surely not in the best interest of the Scottish people, and I admit, and we've supported the SNP and the First Minister on making sure that the UK and Scotland can get the best deal from Brexit. But if the solution to Brexit is to turn away from an even bigger partner, to mount on top of one disastrous constitutional decision at UK level another disastrous constitutional solution, then we're surely in the wrong place. And that comes to the hub of this particular argument. I'm happy to give way.
May I say, is the member suggesting that in the case of Scotland becoming independent, that England would be so petty-minded as to turn away from its nearest neighbour and not continue to trade in any meaningful way with it?
Well, we're back to rerunning the 2014 independence referendum, but the key thing is here, and the Honourable Lady and her party admits this, the best solution in terms of currency for Scotland and the UK is to stay in the currency union. That was their argument in 2014, so they have conceded that particular argument, unless they go down the route of the Honourable Member for East Lothian and go for a separate currency, which he says, in his own words, would have many, many years of fiscal consolidation and would require the selling of assets in order to support a separate currency. Or are they saying the euro? Well, they're not saying that either. So they've already conceded that a currency union with the rest of the UK is the most important thing. And if you look at the figures from the recent GERS report, with the £15 billion fiscal deficit, and the way that they fought for the fiscal framework to make sure that Barnett was maintained, that is an admittance now that the economic and fiscal framework is in Scotland's best interest. So if you take that as the starting point, then in Scotland's best interest to stay in the UK with the fiscal and economic union and the currency union, then you're honestly saying you're going to turn away from all of that in order to be part of the European Union when you don't know what the access requirements would be, you don't know if you would get in. These are all the arguments we had in 2014. Indeed, you could argue the arguments for entry into the EU today are much more difficult than they were in 2014, because there will be no grandfather rights when we decide to leave as a UK. So all of these issues have just muddied the waters much, much more. And the claim of right of the Scottish people in terms of this debate, they have voted quite clearly for Scotland to stay within the United Kingdom, but they also see the benefits and advantages of staying in the EU. And it can't be right to have two polarised camps in terms of Scotland at the moment. You have a Scottish National Party camp that says independence at all costs, and you have a Scottish Conservative Party that say they want Scotland to be in the UK but not in the EU, given the result of the referendum on the EU. And both of those polarised camps are indeed completely wrong. Because what Scotland wants, and indeed what the UK wants, and indeed what the Prime Minister, I'm sure, wants, is for Scotland to stay within the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom to maintain the benefits of being part of and the relationship with the European Union. And that's what people have voted for. That's what the claim of right would tell us they've voted for. And it doesn't address any of the myriad of problems in Scotland. It doesn't deal with our underfunded NHS, the growing attainment gap, the shambles that's Police Scotland, their undervalued and overworked public servants. It doesn't deal with any of those particular issues, because we know the best way to deal with those issues, with the eradication of poverty, the reduction in inequality, all the things we want to see in a much more socially just Scotland, is to maintain the fiscal, economic and currency union with the UK, but to ensure that Scotland's position and advantages of the EU are maintained. And the right honourable gentleman for Surrey Heath is absolutely right. There's no discussion about agriculture, about fisheries, about regional policy, about the environment, about all these issues that I would suggest should go straight back to the Scottish Parliament in terms of their responsibilities, working of close partnership with the rest of the UK. But of course there's a fiscal transfer that would have to happen with that. It's the same fiscal transfer that the honourable gentleman from Surrey Heath had on the side of the bus. His fiscal transfer wants £350 million a day into the NHS. I want £750 million a year more to Scotland, along with these powers, so they can deal with those particular issues that will be repatriated to Scotland. So these are the big issues, Mr Bone, with regards to the claim of right. If it's the case that every political party in Scotland now abides by the words and the principles and the substance of the claim of right, then the Scottish people have spoken. They have said they want to stay because they know it's in their economic, financial, political and cultural interests as part of the UK, but they want to maintain the advantages of being in the EU. And that's a challenge to both the UK government, to the Scottish government and to the entirety of the political, social and cultural civil class in Scotland, to try and make sure we get the best possible deal for the people that we seek to represent. So I'm grateful that the honourable gentleman for Glasgow North has brought this particular debate, and I hope when he stands up at any time in the Westminster Parliament or at SNP conference or indeed in front of his constituency party in Glasgow North, and when he talks about the claim of right, he admits that Scotland voted to stay part of the United Kingdom and indeed moves on to the great opportunities of using the powers of one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world in tax. Indeed, yesterday, my 2 amendments that were carried or the government accepted into the Scotland Bill that transfer all these welfare powers to Scotland, nobody's talking about that, because the obsession with the Constitution is destabilising Scotland, and it's making the uncertainty around Scottish business and Scottish civic society polarised, indeed, in terms of what the Scottish people want. So let's get rid of all these constitutional arguments. Let's repaint buses and take all those lies off the sides of buses. And let's concentrate on what people want, which is the eradication of poverty, reduction in inequality, making sure public services are properly financed, opportunities for our young people, making sure the next generation does better than the current one, make sure we've got adequate housing. Incidentally, Mr Bowen, all the responsibilities of the Scottish Parliament. And that's why we need to protect the fiscal, economic and cultural union with the UK. And that's why we need to make sure we leave no stone unturned in making sure Scotland's position in the EU and the advantages that Scotland gets from the EU is protected. Because that's what the Scottish people have asked for, and it would be a dereliction of duty if we didn't try and deliver it.